Good morning, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to episode 40 of the Cloudcast. We're coming to you live from our massive Cloudcast studios here in Raleigh, North Carolina. Aaron, how are you doing tonight, man?
I'm doing good. So episode 40, does that mean the show's like having a midlife crisis or something?
Yeah, it does feel like maybe we're having a midlife crisis. We've actually gotten kind of good, though. We've gotten to be pretty weekly, pretty consistent. So I think that's our goal for 2012. We finally got our scheduling act together.
We'll see.
Yeah, exactly. We'll see. So you've been quiet on Twitter, but the guy who has not been quiet on Twitter is our guest tonight. So after about a 6-month layoff, and it feels like it hasn't been that long, but good to finally have Brian Katz back on the show. Brian, welcome back.
Thank you, guys. It's good to be back. And I haven't been too quiet on Twitter recently.
I think the last time we had you on, and I went back and looked, it's been about 6 months. It was you and Tal Klein, who at the time was at Citrix, is now over at Bromium. And back then, we were talking, and you were telling us you had like a regular job. You were like director of mobility in the pharmaceutical industry. It feels like these days you're like professional blogger / trade show panel session shit stirrer. You're all over the place, man. What's going on? How come you got so much more visible and sort of audible about what you're doing these days?
Well, I pretty much stopped sleeping, and that kind of gives you a lot of time. I decided to make a commitment to certain things. I'm working really hard. I'm still a director of mobility at a pharmaceutical company. I'm enjoying that. We're doing a lot of cool stuff, but when you do stuff you love, it's kind of easy to talk about it. And when you work so hard during the day, you want to actually have good conversations and engage with people.
Yeah.
So that's where Twitter comes in. That's where I've been lucky enough to ask to be a panelist at a couple different shows recently. And so it's kind of worked out.
So talk real quick about some of the events that you've been going to, because they're different than kind of some of the major maybe vendor trade shows. What are some of the say BYOD, consumerization IT? What are some of the things you've been going to lately?
Well, I don't know that it'd be different from a traditional trade show, being that I went to Interop recently, and they have a whole mobile track which is really growing. So I went in New York last year, and that was the first time they asked me to be a panelist. And I ended up going to Interrupt in Las Vegas and was a panelist there as well, and then went to a couple of cloud stuff. But, there are a lot of people who are more interested in BYOD, consumerization of IT. I did an AirWatch conference recently, and in 2 weeks I'm doing Mobile Connect up in Boston, which is the inaugural of that conference. And I just found out the other day that I will be doing a session at Bryforum in Chicago in July. So
very cool. Yeah, Brian Madden's a good guy. He's not afraid to sort of challenge vendors. He knows his stuff. So yeah, if you're working at Brian's event, you're going to have people that know what they're talking about, are passionate about it. So that's very, very cool. So let's dive into a little bit of this stuff. The thing that jumped out at me, even reading a lot of your blogs, and your blog's called A Screws Loose, for anybody that hasn't been out reading it and is interested in this space. So it sort of dawned on me, the iPad's been out for like two plus years now. We're up to Gen 3 of that. Obviously, there's a ton of other mobility types of devices, whether they're sort of called phones or tablets. And sometimes it feels like we kind of have been discussing this space for a while, and then sometimes I go back and read your blog or I watch some of the threads, and it still feels like maybe we don't have all the basics together. So I wonder if we might take just a couple of minutes before we kind of really get into this, and kind of, from your perspective, level set about a few things that are kind of confusing. So let's start with that, if you're okay with it. What's your take on, or your sort of definition of BYOD versus maybe the biggest misconception you hear about it?
Okay, so that's a great question there, and I talk to a lot of people, and you see a lot of surveys about bring your own device for those that don't know what BYOD is, and I tend to focus on phones and tablets.
Okay.
I tend to leave out the BY. We now have tons of acronyms: BYOC, bring your own computer; BYOL, bring your own laptop. A friend of mine did a post the other day because somebody said BYOB, bring your own behavior. And
Nice.
And well, it's interesting because he heard this, and as people start dealing with BYOB, they realize that a lot of it's based upon the behavior of the people who own the device. And there is a behavior piece of how you treat the device, how work treats it, and everything else. But one of the biggest misconceptions I think about BYOD is BYOD doesn't mean that you put email on a device. So we see a lot of people who will say 75%, 80% of corporations will tell you that they're doing BYOD. And then when you start asking what they're really doing, a lot of them are going to tell you, oh, we let them have email. Whether it's through Good, through a different program, whether it's just Exchange ActiveSync, that's the only thing they allow to happen. And I draw the distinction that in order for it to be a true BYOD device, you have to have access to the corporate ecosystem. So you have to be actually, whether it's SharePoint, Documentum, but you should be looking at documents, you should be able to read them, you should be able to get to the internet websites, fill out forms. If you have SAP that you're doing expenses, you should be able to do all this stuff and have access to that ecosystem. That's true BYOD. And when you start looking at that, that's when you start talking about the data that's important to a company.
Okay. Now, how does that sort of immediately differ? And we won't go into a lot of sort of definitional stuff because this show would get kind of boring. But contrast that to the other acronym that's kind of popped up here quite a bit lately, CoIT, or consumerization of IT. Some folks like to blur those together, mix them together. What's different about those two kind of acronyms or topics or terminologies?
So one way to think of it is the consumerization of IT, which is what CoIT stands for, is the superset, and BYOD is a subset. So BYOD is part of the consumerization of IT. And a lot of people want to treat it separately, and it's not. Because what the consumerization of IT is talking about is end users, employees, just everybody now has stuff at home that's as good or better than what they have at work. If you think back 10 years ago, if you got a laptop, you didn't have one at home. You may have a 386, and at work you were getting a 486, or when Pentium started coming out. You had much better computers, everything else at work that you didn't have access to at home. And now the balance has switched. People have tablets, people have gaming laptops, people have smartphones, and businesses are just starting to look at that stuff. Whereas you have people who are using it for, I think you guys actually use it for exercise. I know you guys do the donut run. And and I know you guys did video from that and a bunch of other stuff. And you can do that, and these are things that businesses were struggling to do 2 or 3 years ago, with what they had. So consumerization of IT is talking about the fact that consumers are much more savvy about technology, really. And the other term that you hear around that is the ITization of the consumer. So consumers are much better at supporting themselves, figuring stuff out. They're becoming a little bit more like IT. They're much more knowledgeable.
Right. Yeah, the other term I love that you use, and this sort of flies in with what Aaron and I like to talk about. So you tend to talk about sort of mobile applications, or you kind of fragment applications between kind of truly mobile, touch aware, maybe API-driven type of applications, and then there's everything else, which is however you deliver it. It's VDI, or it's streaming desktop, or it's terminal service, whatever, and you lump everything else in that into what you call Craplications, and which I love because it's kind of it puts a very distinct point on the stuff that was designed to run on a desktop or Windows, or it wasn't designed for touch, it was designed for a mouse, or it wasn't designed for a 6-inch screen or an 8-inch screen. I think it puts a really distinct kind of wrapper around it to say that's probably not going to work like you expect it to, you got to have kind of a bifurcation of thinking of your applications. Is that fair for how you use that term?
That's part of it.
Okay.
You hit about half of it. So,
okay.
There are Craplications that are built for touch. When you're looking at a Craplication, there are two ways to look at it. Number one, a Craplication is an app that just has a lousy UI, user interface, or a lousy user experience, UX. And, there are apps that people build that you sit there and, you can't figure out what you're supposed to do. There are 20 buttons, but they're too small, they're too big, it doesn't scroll to the next screen. That'll also qualify as a Craplication. And you're absolutely right. The legacy apps that people are, through VDI or whatever else, are making available to tablets and phones. And, I saw somebody recently who was looking at a spreadsheet through VDI, and they had, on a desktop it would have looked great, but they had on a tablet about 30 rows, 15 columns across, and the boxes were so small that when they tried to do anything on it, and they used some engineering that allowed them to have some touch on it, and they couldn't grab the cell. They were zooming or trying to zoom and do all this other stuff, and it was painful to watch. And it's those painful experiences which is what I call Craplications.
Gotcha. So, let's sort of work backwards. So a lot of the blogs that you've written lately, and again, we'll sort of put them out there in the show notes for folks to easily go take a look at them. So you've been talking about a bunch of different aspects of it. Some of them have been behavioral aspects, how people are adopting or creating roadblocks. Some of them are about the technology. But let's kind of work backwards, because I think the one thing that I take out of what you've been talking about a lot lately is I think you've got a vision for how you want to do things, and whether you're fully able to do that at your current job or it's a work in progress is kind of irrelevant. But let's kind of work backwards. Let's say somebody came to you and they said, look, I've got 2 or 3 really good business opportunities that I think if we were able to put the technology in a new way into the hands of the people that could take action. It's sales, it's doctors, it's whatever. Walk me through kind of what success looks like, and then how do you get back to success, right? So sort of working backwards from the business problem is successful because you can bring mobile to it, you can bring the right data at the right place. But what's the model look like getting it right, working backwards to that, at least at a high level?
So at a high level, if we don't go into the individual steps right now, at the high level, what it looks like is whoever it is, let's say it's a salesperson, they have the technology at their fingertips, and it's ubiquitous. So if they want to do a sales presentation, they're not booting up a laptop, they're not, putting in passwords, figuring out where everything is, trying to look at it and fit that themselves and whoever they're selling to behind one screen. It's more of a matter of, hey, here's a presentation, we throw up, let's take an iPad, we throw up an iBook, and you're handing that to the person you want to see it. You're actually letting them walk through it. I did a great example probably about 8 or 10 blog posts ago about a car salesman. And we all know how the experience is just absolutely horrible. But what if, on the other hand, the car salesman, you walk in, they see you, and they say hello, and their first thing to do is to get some information from you, and they want to know what kind of car you're looking for, etc. And as they do that, they have a tablet, and what you see is they're checking a couple boxes. They have a couple of menus that pop down, but it's easy. It doesn't get in the way of the conversation. As they go through the conversation, they say, "So the kind of car you're looking for, what color do you want it to be?" And they go through all that stuff, and then they say, "Okay, so why don't you look at some tech sheets?" And they hand the tablet to the customer, and the customer can actually look at the tech sheets, scroll through them. It's not they get 5 different pamphlets. It's they get one tablet. The software's there. They can compare it, and oh, by the way, if they're looking at two different models or two different cars, they can compare them right there on the screen. And when they're done, the salesman says, well, as opposed to me collecting the information from you, who you are and everything, how about you send the brochures to yourself, and if it's okay with you, we're going to take your email address and phone number and all, and now they already got some data in the system. And then you start talking about a test drive. So you look at the different cars that you did, the colors that you did, and as you're doing that, so you're looking at the pamphlets, you know what color they want, and you're handing the tablet back to the salesperson. They go, let's see what we have on the lot. Now, in the past, what that meant was going through this big sheaf of papers or going to a green terminal where, they're not exactly touch typing, they're hunt and pecking. Here, they already know the car, they look through the lot and say, you know what, we have that color, or we don't have that color, but we have the exact car you're looking for in this color. And at the same time, maybe they have a key fob that they hold up using NFC to the tablet, and now they have the key so they can go take you for a test drive. Okay, so they're sitting in the car and they have questions, so you just pull over right there and you say, okay, let's pull over. You hand them the iPad. They want to know what the horsepower is or something else. You can go through it. And if there's someone else with them, they can do it in the passenger seat, and you can look through all that stuff. And then when you get back to the showroom, if they say, hey, let's make a deal, you already have that information there. You don't have to spend hours filling out forms. You may ask 2 or 3 more questions, but now you're sending it to the financial person, and then you have to go through all that fun stuff. But the point is, what you're trying to do is actually make it ubiquitous. They didn't sit there. You didn't have to go sit down in front of a big computer and do all this stuff. Another example, you mentioned like a doctor. Or a clinician. You walk into a clinic, you're going to take a test or whatever, they're going to ask you questions. They can have a big bulky clipboard, or they can walk around with a little bit of with a tablet, and as they're asking you questions, this stuff gets synced automatically. If a flag gets thrown up because you have a symptom, you can actually see if other people have that symptom. You can do real-time data right there. So when you ask me what it should look like, it's delivering the information that the people who are your employees or at the endpoint need when they need it and where they need it. And that doesn't mean you have to be chained to a desk anymore.
So let me ask you this then. So what of everything you just, the picture you just painted, what pieces are possible today, and what are the biggest holes that need to be addressed today?
Almost everything's possible today. The holes that have to be addressed, there are 2 or 3 pieces that have to be addressed. If we were in a perfect world, everything's possible today except for maybe some of the security. But if we don't talk about security for a second, one of the things I talk about in a lot of my posts is we tend to lock data up in enterprises. I work in a big enterprise. I think both of you work in enterprises where we put data away, we limit access, we're very careful about how we do that sort of stuff. And what we find that happens is it's very difficult to deliver that data to the employee who needs it. And what I talk about a lot is taking that data and opening it up and building an API to access that data, building an identity system so you can prove identity at the same time, and then you build apps at the other end that access that API and give the information to the person in the mode that they need it. You can do all that today. There are a couple companies that are doing that, some faster than others. What's missing is right now most companies are in a legacy mode. And what I mean by that is their strategy is very much, we need to protect the device. So it's still the old days of your computer's locked down, you're going to work everything that way, you encrypt the drive, you have to log in with AD, you have all these other pieces that work together, antivirus, everything else, and what we need to move to is a point where we're protecting the information, and the policy travels with the information versus the device. So
yes, and what you're saying there is kind of the key point I'm getting out of that is the data doesn't reside on the device permanently. And that's probably a key difference in the enterprise today. The reason why everyone's trying to lock it down all the time is because the data could potentially be on that device and could leak out, correct?
Well, sure. And the answer is, even in a mobile world, the data should, in many cases, have to stay on the device for a while. You have to prepare for being able to work offline as well as online. It's one of the reasons that when people talk about VDI and other stuff, well, that's kind of difficult. Take a sales rep that has to go sell to a doctor in a hospital. You see all the signs where they tell you to turn off your cell phones and your cell radios. Well, what happens when you're offline and your presentation's back in corporate? And you have to do that through VDI. So there is data on the device, but that doesn't mean you can't protect the data on the device without necessarily making the device so difficult to access that people don't want to use it. We call that mobile information management. And part of, I've heard people say, well, you're talking about, DRM and some of these other things. And no, what we're really talking about is encryption and a little bit of corporate tagging to know that it's corporate data. But if you put encrypted data on a device and then you encrypt it with a certificate and everything, and you have two-factor authentication, if you revoke that certificate, even if someone takes that device, they can't access that data, regardless of what app gets into it.
Okay.
Does that make sense, guys?
Yep.
Yeah. So talk for a second. You just mentioned mobile information management. I think sometimes it's called MIM or MIM, and then we also sometimes hear mobile device management or mobile application management. Talk real quick about the difference between those things and why some people are interested in managing devices and others are interested in managing the application. What's going on? What's the thinking behind why there's all those different terms?
Pretty simple. So think of it this way. Mobile device management, when I talk about legacy thinking, legacy strategy, that's pretty much what mobile device management is. It's locking down the device. You can do a wipe of the entire device. You can lock it remotely. You can clear passcode if someone forgets what it is. And, if they put the passcode in too many times, it'll initiate an auto wipe. You can pass information to it. You could, if you wanted to, track it via GPS, because most of them have GPS chips in it. But the analogy to make with that is MDM is dead. I've been saying this for years, and the analogy that I've been making is, if you remember back in the early 2000s, you had SMS 2.0, and that was the product. Everybody talked about managing the machine, and you used SMS. And what you found was SMS was functionality that was moved into SCCM, was moved into other products, BMC. Everybody has that type of feature now. So MDM moves from a product to a feature eventually, and it gets taken over by MAM, where MAM is mobile application management, where you're actually managing the applications themselves, not the device. So, for example, you might not password protect your whole device. You might only password protect your applications. So in a device that is a BYO device, you can have your own applications and use them any way you'd like, but when you're using corporate applications, you're going to have to log in, provide some authentication to them, and the data is locked in those applications. And the next step on that is mobile information management, where you're not necessarily locking the applications, but the policies on the data. And when an application sees corporate data, it takes a lockdown mode, but when it sees your own data, it's on an open mode.
Okay. And all of these things, I know there's some companies today that are kind of in that space. I want to say Symantec bought one of the companies recently, and then you've got people like VMware who are touting these things where it's like, well, we'll kind of bifurcate the device, right? You'll run your personal stuff in a personal VM, and you'll run your corporate stuff in a corporate VM. I mean, are those all variations of the same aspect of managing either an application or the device, or are they really very, very different ways, very, very kind of different models?
They're different models.
Okay.
And there are really three different models right now. There is the VMware model, and there's another company called Enterprise that does something similar. Different levels, but what the VMware model does is what they do best. They have a hypervisor, and they actually create two VMs, or actually you have your phone and you have a second phone essentially on your device, which is a VM.
Okay.
So you have the original device, you have your original phone, and then you have your VM, and that VM you can store the same applications or different applications, but that becomes your corporate one. So if the phone's ever compromised or anything else, or let's say you leave the company, they delete that VM, but they leave your data alone. Some of the drawbacks to that are now you have to be aware when you actually are on your corporate side or you're on your personal side. And for example, if you can only make phone calls for work on your corporate side, well, what do you do when the phone rings? And how do you know which one to answer? Or if you're going to make a call to your wife or whatever else, you have to make sure you're on the right one so minutes get charged appropriately. Right. Time gets charged appropriately. If you want to dash a quick note off to somebody, or you're going to write up, you're on a tablet and you want to write up, a note to whoever, you have to make sure you're in the right container to do that. And I'm not a huge fan of it because I don't think consumers really want that model where they have two of everything, two apps, one on the corporate side, one on the personal side, and they actually have to put in thinking to which side they're on when they're using a device.
Yeah. It seems very, it just screams of the bastard operator from hell kind of thing, right? That.
Well, it's like unbelievably mistake prone. I mean, I do it all the I do it all the time. Like, I just thinking as you're talking about it, I do it all the time because, like, on my iPhone, they'll merge all your emails, and I've got a Gmail account and a corporate account, and it picks one by default. So I'm constantly sending work emails that by default are going back to Gmail. I don't even think about it.
I do that too.
And I'm sure because of autofill, the people on the other end just start typing in a few letters and they send them back to me. So yeah, I mean it's all sorts of error prone if nothing else. So cool.
So that's one way of doing it. The second way is most people have heard of good mobile messaging, and they have what they call containerization. And what that means is you have a separate, they started off as an email company, and your email was in a separate encrypted container, but you opened the app, and that was your corporate mail. And it couldn't mix with anything else on your device. They've now come out with good dynamics, and what that is they're building containers around applications. They just released Copian, which is one for SharePoint and other stuff. They're working with a couple of other vendors so that they can create a giant container that it's similar, but it really is different from the VMware stuff because you're in that container when you're using your data.
The container is a little more seamless. And does that also handle, like, one of the things I was just thinking about is, okay, I've got a phone and I'm looking at my corporate email and, there's an attachment and I want to open it, but I have to save it to the phone to be able to look at it. And if we don't have that, effectively, you kind of had some data leakage there potentially if it's my personal device or it's something I could very easily save off. But in that environment, does that saving of an attachment reside within the container?
Yes. So
okay. So it helps with that issue.
Absolutely. And if you want to open that attachment directly from the mail, with good dynamics, they're providing helper applications that allow you to open it and look at it, but they're secure. So the data is kept within that container. Any cache or any documents that you write are kept within that container. So, it certainly got some very good points. There are a lot of people who are looking to do that sort of containerization. And then you have the third model, which is really Nucona, which was bought by Symantec. There was Wrap that was bought by AppSense. There's a company called Mocana that does it. There are a few other smaller ones that are doing it. And some of the MDM vendors are going that way now too. That what you actually do is you're wrapping individual apps. and they have an SDK or an API that they're using. And when you open a document in there, you're doing things like, okay, let's turn off taking a screenshot. Let's turn off everything but corporate email while you're in that app. Let's not allow them to save to any cloud but our corporate cloud. And you can build that into each app. And so therefore, when you get an app from the App Store, your internal App Store, you have these pieces built in that allow you to do that. Where that falls short at the moment is there really aren't too many people who can wrap public apps that you get from the Apple Store or the Google Play Store, and especially from Apple. Apple doesn't want you to change something that's been submitted. There are companies that say they can do it, and there are companies that are demonstrating some technology, but there's also some negotiation with Apple and everything else that has to go there for that to be kosher.
Gotcha. So, we talk. I mean, we haven't dove into a lot of the technologies. I think you're much better off kind of digging into your blog. What are for folks, whether it's your experience or people you've been talking to, what are the big barriers? You talked a little bit about, kind of the legacy thinking about applications, or some of the legacy thinking about devices, but whether it's legal stuff or security stuff, what are you hearing, like one or two consistent big roadblocks to people getting started or being successful at their first couple of mobile applications?
Well, let's take a step back before we hit mobile applications, because there are some stumbling blocks. Because right now you can't look anywhere without seeing BYOD being mentioned, and you need to do BYOD. And it saves money. It does a bunch of other things. It cures cancer. BYOD is the panacea for today's age, at least for the enterprise. And that's not true. But some of the roadblocks you're starting to see is legal starting to look at this stuff, and they're starting to say, wait a second, if there's corporate data on the device, is there a way to remove that data without affecting the personal data that's on someone's bring your own device? And there's some technologies that are starting to enable that, but they're not necessarily guarantees. So legal's saying you have to wipe the entire device. And where they run into problems is, well, that's somebody's personal device and their personal data's on there. And there have actually been a couple of lawsuits that have been successful for the people who were suing, that in one case someone misplaced the device got wiped, and a novel that they had been writing on their device went up in smoke, and they sued, and if I remember correctly, they won $2.1 million.
Now, what did you call that? You and I had a DM the other day. You called that like AUP?
So one of the things that you really desperately need if you're going to do bring your own device is you need an acceptable use policy. And I abbreviate at AUP, and I have a blog post called The Secret Sauce for BYOD. And what's important about an acceptable use policy is it can't just be what you shouldn't do. So a lot of companies, when they write an acceptable use policy, says you may not surf porn, you may not take data off the device. If you lose the device, you must call in so we can wipe it. You can't do this, you can't do that. And one of the things with an acceptable use policy is it's got to spell out what they want you to do as well. And a good example of that is Coca-Cola bottling has seen, I think the number is they've seen a 30% rise when they handed out iPads and trained their people how to use it, their salespeople. But one of the things Coca-Cola bottling told every single person they had an iPad to was they said, you have to put Angry Birds on your iPad. We want you to play it. And the reason they did that was people actually got used to doing the swiping and the finger gestures and moving around the iPad. They got comfortable through playing the game, so that when they were giving presentations and filling out the paperwork, it was just as smooth. And they looked smooth in front of the people they were selling it to. This was Coca-Cola's way of trying to make the technology and the new method of using a device ubiquitous for the user themselves, so that they look comfortable and they were comfortable with the device. But yeah, and an AUP's got to be written, got to be spelled out in English. If legal says they're going to wipe a device, you need to put it in there. We're going to wipe your entire device. One of the things that people discuss, especially in a regulated industry like financials, healthcare, and everything else, is when you face a lawsuit, you have something called legal hold. Well, with BYOD, does that mean that they're going to actually take an iPad? And if that's your iPad or your Android phone, your Windows phone, can they take it if it's your personal device? And what recourse do you have? And should they provide you a new one while they're holding on to it? And those are the sorts of things that people have to be comfortable with, or they're not going to want to participate.
And would you also include, so you wrote a very interesting blog post today. It was one of those kind of thought-provoking posts about BYOD, and let's say, for instance, somebody takes a phone that they've purchased and an iPad that they've purchased, and they go on a trip, and they, for one reason or another, one or both of them break, and it's pretty critical for your corporate success and your corporate funding and a corporate trip. What is the responsibility at that point? If you have to replace that phone, are you going to replace it, or if you break that iPad, are you going to replace it? Because at that point, it's kind of considered business critical, and is that something that would also be covered under an acceptable use policy?
It should be covered under an acceptable use policy, and it should be covered in the planning. Most people don't think of that situation, and we've all read VMware, for example, has pushed everybody to a bring your own device for telephones. Well, if you send somebody on a trip and their device breaks and they need that device to do their work, does it make sense? The example in the blog, the company had already spent $5,000 to send them to the meeting, and depending upon what the person's working on at that meeting, if they can't participate as well without the materials, you could be losing $100 million because it takes longer to implement a solution for whatever they're doing. So you do need to look at that, and there are also legal ramifications. There was one company that I read about recently, and I apologize, I don't recall the name, that actually told people you have to buy insurance when you buy your phone. That's part of the deal. You're going to pay for insurance. Well, if you're requiring it, maybe the company should pay for it. And it becomes this whole thing of stuff that you need to really think through. And, if you don't, when it happens, you're going to have to make some split decisions that affect the rest of your policy and the rest of your project.
Yeah, no, I think the more and more I've sort of done some research looking into this, the more you see some of these use cases like you talked about, where it's like, who should pay for this? Should this be part of the policy? What's the gray area around some of those things? And then we hear stories like Hoff, like Chris Hoff Beaker was telling, he was telling two stories here the last couple of days. One, he left his iPad on an airplane, and so here's one of the guys who is thinking about security 24/7 and is sort of world renowned, and there goes probably a bunch of corporate information. Now, what they do and encrypt stuff and secure stuff, who knows? And then the other story he's telling is they decided to go to a string-based login onto your phone. So instead of just 4 or 5 digits, it's now like a long string because somebody probably thought, oh, we're going to do great password management. Well, all of a sudden, he's like, I'm going to die driving with the sales guy because he's trying to put in a 16 character with ampersands and all kinds of crap password because they want to be secure about that device. And yeah, and Brian, you live that all the time. Like, I got to imagine people come up with all sorts of scenarios.
One of the very first posts I wrote probably 6 months ago was the fact that it's really got to be a balance between risk and reward. You have to look at risk mitigation. It's no longer security can just say, you can't do this, you can't do that. No. Because in the end, if you can't do all those things, and these are tools that are going to help you be profitable and make money, well, security is not going to have a job because nobody's going to be able to pay them.
Right.
And so there's a big part of that. And one of the reasons that people move, like for example, if you're on an Apple device, you want an 8-character password because that password becomes part of the seed for encryption. And you want to get above 4 or 5 digits. So you want to be 6, preferably around 8. It doesn't necessarily mean that you need to have complexity in there. It's not a bad thing, but the whole goal is to actually make sure that people can remember it. But a password isn't necessarily bad if the timeout isn't a minute. If the timeout's a minute, so if you don't touch your device in a minute, it's going to relock and you have to put the password in, you better believe that car is going to crash. Yeah. On the other hand, if the timeout's an hour, because conceivably you'll know, an hour is about enough time. You tend to pick up your phone once an hour. You're doing a presentation to somebody, you're a salesperson or you're a clinician. You don't have to unlock it all the time. Now you've found a balance, and you've found that amount of time that works. And that's where you have to do with all that. So, does that make any sense to you?
No, I think it does. I think it's it's one of these things where I almost would guess that to be successful at some of this, you got to draw from outside experience of people that have to deal with these things. So the first thing that jumped to mind is when there are like big sporting events, right? So you're a big Premier League soccer guy. I mean, you could get really secure and worry about the safety of the players and have metal detectors trying to get in. But if you got to get 80,000 people in there, you'll never get them into the stadium or out of the stadium. And so at some point you say, like, what's the right security versus the thing we're trying to do for the business? And it applies to mobile devices and it applies to a lot of things. So yeah, there's some level of common sense and reality that kind of has to get worked in there. And
I mean, I can tell you one of the things that when I've talked to people about password policy is people are much more willing to do an 8-character password if you don't make them change it every 45 days, which is something that, if you go into any enterprise, they're usually between 45, 60, a few of them will go as long as 90 on your laptop or desktop before you have to change your password. Well, does it make sense to make them do that on their phone? Or maybe it's, let's give you 6 months or a year. And now it's not so bad to have a slightly longer password. You don't have to worry about remembering. It gets automatic. And you have a whole entire year before you have to change it again. Now, hopefully you're only using that password on that device, but, there's some common sense in there that we can't help.
Yep, absolutely. Well, listen, Brian, as of last time and this time, excellent stuff. I think we're sort of bumping into that time limit that we try and keep the show to. So we will absolutely have to have you back, hopefully before 6 months again. This was too long. Aaron, you want to any final thoughts, or you want to take us home?
Yeah, absolutely. So we are out of time for this week. So, Brian, where can everyone follow you and find out more information about what you're following in the mobile space?
Well, the easiest way is Twitter. Easiest way to reach me, easiest way to talk to me. I love to interact. BM Katz. So that's the easiest way. And then screwsloose.com is my blog, and I've actually challenged myself in the last week or so to try and do a post every weeknight. So every now and then you just want to refresh and pump words out and get the thoughts out of your head, and that's kind of what I've been doing recently.
Very cool. Very cool. All right. You can follow us on Twitter at thecloudcastnet or reach us on the web at thecloudcast.net, where you can check out our newly designed and updated website. And you will find links to the show, our YouTube channel, the show notes, and details on how to get us on iTunes and Stitcher. So thanks for listening, everybody.